Moving on, Gillian, I'm just wondering, one of the things we've talked about a lot over the years is standards in public life. And with the last government, we had all sorts of concerns, and now we've got a new government, and we're seeing what's happening in politics on both sides of the pond. What's your freshest thinking in that area?
I think we all know in terms of standards in public life have been ripped apart over the past decade and completely undermined governance within public services. And I think it's not just within the UK, obviously, across the pond too. So it's back to basics, really. Where do we start? Do we try to reintroduce what was already there, which clearly didn't work? Or do we need some fresh thinking around new frameworks and a new way of thinking about governance? And if that's the case, the time and the opportunity is now to actually do that in a way that hopefully gets the buy-in from those within government, and also with the emphasis on restoring public trust in terms of having a honest and open government.
Do you think that there might have been the rules and such, but that there was no teeth behind that? Or do you think we do need to really go right back to basics and start again?
I don't actually think that having the teeth there is the solution. It doesn't matter how good your governance systems are, how many boxes you tick, how well your procedures are performing, all of the sort of hard systems type of stuff, how good that is, because an individual or a group of individuals will always find a way of circumventing them if they want to. And it's how you actually deal with that aspect. So it's much more about culture and it's much more about ethics, which are all very soft and very difficult to police in many ways.
Absolutely, that really speaks to me. It really is about values, it's about integrity. It comes down to character. Mm-hmm. And yet, the challenge is when we've seen some of our political leaders behave in ways that aren't the sort of behaviours we want to see. We've talked about cronyism, democracy, all of that. People really serving themselves rather than the country. It's where do we find those role models? And it gets me thinking that it really starts at such a young age, from very early on. What are the behaviours they're seeing that really set the standard? I don't know what the answer is there. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's really engendering it from a very young age, because if you don't, the worst case scenario, and you can see this in some of the developing countries, is that younger population have become so corrupt in terms of that they think it's the norm and that's how you do things, that at some point the country's governance system is just going to break down in terms of the social and economic systems will dissipate. So you've really got to, I think, start at a relatively young age. And also it's got to be built into some of the programs that we've been involved in terms of the leadership and development programs. It can't be underestimated in terms of the value of thinking about creating good cultures and environments and the implications for governance in and around that.
Yeah. I think the challenge, of course, is that the likes of Donald Trump, his social media has such a big impact, which can outstrip anything that we might be trying to do on the ground, because people think that's what you need to do to be successful, that's what you need to do in order to get on. And so my hope is that we are seeing a different way of being, a different way of leading. Kamala Harris certainly seems to sum up many good things, perhaps particularly with her prosecutor background. And then, of course, we're seeing Tim Walz with this new tone of masculinity, which is really showing that as a man, you can really embrace many of the soft skills that we talk about, the empathy, the compassion, the listening, all of that. So my hope is that we are starting to see a shift, and let's just hope by November that they get in. Of course, here I'm revealing all my political leanings, but I don't think it's really a matter of Republican or Democrat over there. I think it really is about that threat to democracies and the risk of becoming failing states if something doesn't happen to right things. What do you think?
Yeah, there are positive tones coming out of what's happening in the US. you mentioned the three words or three ideas around honesty, compassion, listening. Accountability is a pretty big one as well in terms of taking accountability, which, as we know from our experience, that has been shifted aside through previous governments. So I think there's a lot to sort of take in there, but also policies. I think it's important in terms of the positive policy aspect comes out from any potential government, which if you look at, the Donald Trump, Kamala Harris sort of thing, Donald Trump is running a negative campaign. You don't really hear much about his policies. And if you do, they're a bit iffy. And Kamala Harris, I think, whilst the values, the openness and the honesty is coming out, what are the key policies and what are those policies going to impact? How are they going to impact on the people?
Yes, I think in the coming weeks she'll stand or fall depending on what she's able to say about policy. People are wanting to see that detail. And of course it shifts the conversations back to policy rather than insults and all of that. And that's the thing that could get Donald Trump back in. Not that I think he's got the right policies, but people always think it's about the economy. And it is about the economy, but I think you can have a thriving economy. But if the quality of leadership is such that the culture and the behaviours have fallen away so much, I don't really think it is about the economy anymore. It has to be about more than that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And one of the problems, I think, that particularly around governance and government frameworks is that how do you link good governance, positive governance, to effective performance? So you can talk about the economy. And the problem is, I don't think, and I may well be corrected, that there's any research out there that says there is a link. For example, you could have really good governance and really poor performance. And equally, you could have a big, strong performing economy and equally a really poor set of poor governance there in terms of poor leadership, unethical leadership, etc. Where is the incentive to have a good governance framework there? And I think if the two could be linked in such a way, if that positive link could be much more affirmative, then there's a selling point, isn't there, for good governance?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because so often people talk about the economy and it's all about growth. And of course, with the Elon Musks and such, you could have rapid growth. You could have really high-performing companies that are making huge pots of money. But if that doesn't somehow have a positive impact on the rest of society, and if there aren't the measures in place to make sure that is distributed and that everybody is benefiting and all of that, then that really doesn't give us what we need these days. And yet in the States, certainly, I see that so many of the big pharma, tech and such will possibly still go towards Trump simply because all they're really interested in is growth. And those performance indicators need to be about more than growth. They need to be about, as you say, governance, but about policies that make sure that everybody is benefiting.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the more inequality you create within societies, then back to what you said earlier, the more likely that you're going to have a failing state at some point in time. And politicians might kick that down the road in terms of it's not going to happen whilst they're in office, but thinking about sustainability and future generations going forward, they're kicking it down that road and it will eventually happen. And that's, I think, the growing inequality should be a real concern to any government around the world. And you've quite rightly said, in terms of the focus shouldn't always just be on growth. Really, it's about how you redistribute that success across all parts of society. And we know there's political choices and how you actually do that. And obviously that's how governments are elected, but it is a real concern.
And of course, society has to be beyond our borders, and whether people are willing to look at that is one of the things I find fascinating about Tim Walsh, who I keep coming back to. But he is a geographer by background and social scientist. Everybody talks about, this,
Mm.
good dad vibe and he's a coach, but so much more than that. He was talking about the use of data and geographical information systems to determine the policies that you're making. And he actually talked about our neighbours, and he was talking about our neighbours across the world and how we needed to be good neighbours and we needed to think of them in the policies that we were making. And I thought, gosh, that would be a step too far for many Americans watching that. But his worldview is very much like that. Now, we'll probably have to curtail that because, as you say, you need policies that get you elected. But I thought it was fascinating to see him talking in those terms.
Yeah, a true internationalist in many ways. And the UK used to be good at that, I think. We've lost our way quite a bit there, really. But yeah, the scope in terms of collaboration, greater collaboration across the world to deal with some of the challenges that are impacting on us all. So to look for solutions in and around migration, which that in itself is likely to get worse as an issue as climate change has an impact, and for governments to collaborate and have policies that can future-proof the issues through migration and climate change and the like. And so I'm a great supporter of that.
And I think, going back to Walsh, I think what's fascinating is that a boy born in Nebraska in a town of 400 people who spent his teenage summers on a farm where that they happened to have some copies of National Geographic, and he would sit and read those in the breaks. And that was what spurred him on to go to China, travel, and think internationally. And so education, an early education into these things and seeing the wider world and our role in it, I think is so crucial. And with the news that we're reading about today in the Middle East and other problems internationally, maybe we have to hit rock bottom before we finally start to think about things in a bigger way, where we start to join things up, where we start to, as you say, look to the future about sustainability and the world we want for the generations to come. I do worry that things might need to get worse before people really are forced to look at these bigger issues in a more global way.
Well, I hope that isn't the case, 𝗵𝗍, because the worst case scenario would be potentially a world war or something, and I hope we don't get to that sort of stage at all. I think there are some positive changes and new governments, and let's hope in terms of that those that are just coming to power are more optimistic about the future and willing to make positive changes and policy, but also in terms of look to our international partners, really, to help with some of these issues.
It does sound negative, although I suppose, drawing on my Buddhist practice, it's this notion that it's always darkest before the dawn. So the dawn does come. There is always spring after winter. But things move in cycles, which might sound really negative in a way, but it just makes me wonder about the nature of things and how things evolve.